1 minute ago, Devil Diddy dangled woman off, 17th floor. Briana's shocking testimony exposed crime. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge entered and the crowd settled into their seats. The trial of Sean Diddy Combs, the famed music mogul, was about to take another unexpected turn. For weeks, the public had followed every detail of the case, each piece of evidence, and each witness stirring a mixture of disbelief and anger. This wasn't just about celebrity drama. This was about serious charges of abuse, coercion, and trafficking. It was a cold morning, and Briana Bangolan was about to take the stand. Briana, known to many as Cassie Ventura's close friend, had been one of the few people brave enough to testify against the man who had terrorized her friend for years. Cassie, a former lover of Diddy, had been through hell at his hands, but Briana's testimony was about to shed light on even darker corners of Diddy's abuse. Briana walked up to the witness stand, her face pale but resolute. The silence in the courtroom felt deafening. The defense attorneys had been preparing for her testimony, but nobody was ready for what came next. "I've seen it all. The way he treated Cassie was beyond anything you could imagine." Briana began, her voice shaking slightly but unwavering. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on her. The only sounds were the soft tapping of a pen on a notepad, and the occasional shuffle of feet. Briana was no stranger to the abuse. She had witnessed Diddy's erratic behavior firsthand, not just towards Cassie but towards her as well. There had been moments when she had tried to intervene to stand up to him, but she always regretted it. He was untouchable, and his rage was unpredictable. Her story began on a cold evening in 2016. Briana had been staying over at Cassie's apartment, trying to get away from the constant tension in her own life. But what she didn't expect was to witness an event that would haunt her for years to come. "I was there the night he lost it," Briana continued, her eyes now fixed on the jury. Cassie and Diddy had been fighting like they always did. She was crying and he was screaming at her. "I've never seen someone as angry as he was that night." The defense attorney tried to interject, but the judge silenced them with a wave of his hand. Briana had a story to tell, and no one was going to stop her. Briana's recollection was vivid. She described the violence that had erupted when she tried to defend her friend. Diddy's rage had been quick, explosive. He grabbed Cassie by the arm, throwing her across the room like a rag doll. Briana could hear Cassie's cries for help, but when she rushed to intervene, she found herself the target of his fury. "I tried to help her, but Diddy wasn't having it. He turned on me," Briana said, her voice breaking slightly as she remembered. "He grabbed me by the arm, pulled me towards the balcony, and for a moment I thought I was going to die." The room was still, everyone hanging on her every word. "He told me he could kill me. He said he was the devil and he wasn't afraid to do it. Then, without warning, he lifted me off the ground and held me over the balcony rail. I couldn't believe what was happening. My feet were dangling and I couldn't move." Briana's words hit the room like a sledgehammer. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs, was now eerily silent. The jury, the lawyers, the audience, everyone was frozen in disbelief. "Then he let me go, tossing me back into the apartment like I was nothing," Briana said, wiping away a tear. "I thought I was going to die. I really did." Briana's testimony was devastating. She didn't just describe an angry outburst. She described a calculated act of intimidation, an attempt to instill fear and control. Diddy had used his power over Cassie and anyone close to her as a weapon, but the story didn't end there. Briana's testimony painted a chilling picture of what happened next. It wasn't just that night. After that, things got worse. Cassie disappeared for days and no one knew where she was. I went to Diddy's house trying to find her. I was terrified for my friend. When I got there, I was locked inside. No food, no water, just trapped waiting. The courtroom gasped. The defense shifted uneasily, but they were powerless in the face of Briana's truth. I don't know how long I was there, but I could hear Cassie screaming. I wanted to break down the door, but I knew I couldn't. If I did, Diddy would make sure I never saw the light of day again. Briana paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Eventually, Diddy came to the door, laughing like it was all some kind of sick joke. But I knew. I knew that Cassie was suffering and there was nothing I could do. She finally stopped speaking, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Her testimony had painted a picture of a man so powerful, so controlling, that he would stop at nothing to keep his victims in line. As the courtroom processed her words, it was clear that this was only the beginning. Briana's testimony connected directly to the timeline of Cassie's abuse, matching reports that had been leaked to the press. The case was growing stronger by the minute. The prosecution had no doubts now. Diddy's actions, his manipulation, and his violence were all part of a much larger, deeply disturbing pattern. But as Briana stepped down from the stand, the defense knew they had to do everything they could to discredit her. They couldn't let this testimony stand without a fight. The battle in the courtroom was only just beginning. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Briana's testimony had shattered any illusion of Diddy being a harmless mogul with a bit of a temper. Her chilling accounts of violence, threats, and fear had painted a picture of a man with a deep need for control, someone willing to go to extreme lengths to silence those who tried to stand against him. As Briana's words lingered in the air, the audience was left in stunned silence. But the defense had just begun their attack. Nicole Westmoreland, Diddy's defense attorney, rose from her seat with a determined look on her face. She was ready to strike, to poke holes in Briana's account, and to discredit the very foundation of her testimony. The defense team had been preparing for this moment to shake the jury's confidence in the victims and their stories. Ms. Bangolan Westmoreland began, her voice icy and controlled. "You claim that Diddy dangled you over a 17-story balcony, but how can you be certain of the exact details when you were under the influence of drugs at the time?" The room held its breath as Briana shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. The defense knew this was a weak point in her testimony. Briana had admitted to using cocaine and other substances during that period, but her response was steady. "I was on drugs, yes. But that doesn't mean I'm lying," Briana replied, her voice growing stronger. "I remember what happened to me. I remember the terror. Diddy's rage, his threats, they're burned into my memory." Westmoreland pressed further. "And yet you didn't mention the alleged threats or the balcony incident when you first spoke to the authorities. Why was that?" Briana hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to her hands. The defense was right. She had kept quiet about many details when she first spoke to the authorities, but now she could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe Diddy was capable of something like that. I didn't think people would believe me. But Cassie's pain made me realize I had to speak up," she said, lifting her chin, her voice laced with conviction. Despite her strong words, the defense continued to chip away at her credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in her statements and questioning her memory. Briana's testimony, however, had already planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. They had seen the bruises, the emotional scars, and now they were hearing the details of a life lived in constant fear. While the defense worked tirelessly to discredit Briana, the prosecution knew they had a powerful ally: the digital evidence. The forensic video expert Frank Piazza had already analyzed the footage that had been submitted as part of the evidence. Today, his testimony would play a crucial role in confirming the reality of what Briana and Cassie had claimed all along. Frank Piazza took the stand, his demeanor calm and methodical. He was a professional in his field, a forensic video expert with over 25 years of experience. His task was simple: to confirm whether the surveillance and cell phone videos from the hotel incident were authentic. The room was silent as Piazza explained the technical details, but the impact of his words was profound. He confirmed that the video footage showing Diddy attacking Cassie was legitimate. The video, which had been captured by surveillance cameras and a cell phone, showed Diddy dragging Cassie through the hallway, kicking her and grabbing her by the hair. There was no doubt in Piazza's mind the footage had not been altered or tampered with. It was real. Briana's testimony, now backed by concrete evidence, had set the stage for what was to come next. As the video played in the courtroom, everyone saw the truth in undeniable clarity. Diddy's violent behavior wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern of control abuse and manipulation. The defense tried to counter the video evidence, claiming the footage was taken out of context, but Piazza was firm in his assessment. There was no question about the authenticity of the video, and the jury was left to ponder the implications of what they had just witnessed. Diddy's actions were no longer rumors or accusations. They were captured on camera in real time. As the video footage ended, the courtroom fell silent once more. The defense, having failed to discredit Briana's testimony, or the video evidence, was left with few options. But there was still one person who could sway the jury, one person who had the power to manipulate the public's perception: Oprah Winfrey. Oprah had been vocal in her support of Diddy, claiming that the public's perception of him was based on sensationalism and half-truths. She had even taken the stand earlier in the trial, defending him and downplaying the seriousness of the charges. But now the prosecution was preparing to confront her directly. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution prepared to bring Oprah's statements into the spotlight. Her defense of Diddy, her claims that he was being unfairly targeted, would now be tested against the hard evidence of abuse. The prosecution was ready to challenge Oprah, to force her to confront the reality of what Diddy had done. As the next witness took the stand, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The battle for truth had only just begun, and it was clear that Diddy's defense team was willing to fight dirty to protect their client. But with the digital evidence, Briana's testimony, and the mounting allegations against him, it was becoming increasingly difficult for anyone to deny the truth. For Cassie, Briana, and the other victims, this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The stakes were high, and the world was watching. The day began with an unexpected turn of events. As the court gathered, the prosecution had something significant to present: digital evidence that would make the defense squirm. Frank Piazza, the forensic video expert, had just wrapped up his testimony, confirming the authenticity of the videos that showed Diddy's violent behavior toward Cassie Ventura. But there was another bombshell the prosecution was preparing to drop. This time it wasn't about the videos, but the people involved in the cover-up, and none more prominent than Oprah Winfrey. Oprah had taken the stand earlier in the trial, defending Diddy with the kind of unwavering loyalty that only a close friend could offer. She dismissed the accusations as a product of the media circus, claiming that the man she knew was far from the monster the world was portraying him to be. But now the prosecution had one thing Oprah could never escape: the cold, hard facts. The media mogul had once been the voice of reason in the public eye, but her testimony in Diddy's defense was now under scrutiny. Oprah had claimed that the charges against Diddy were exaggerated, that the violent encounters were being manipulated by the press. But in light of the evidence, her testimony now seemed like a convenient narrative, one that overlooked the brutal reality. "Miss Winfrey," the prosecutor began, "you have positioned yourself as an ally of Mr. Combs. But what does it say about your judgment when you defend a man with a history of violent behavior? Do you believe that your wealth and influence are enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions?" Oprah's composure faltered slightly. She had been a witness in this case, but now she was part of the story. Her defense of Diddy had been clear, but the mounting evidence painted a different picture. "Mr. Combs has made mistakes." Oprah said, her voice steady. "But this is a far cry from the allegations against him." But the prosecution wasn't about to let her dodge responsibility. The courtroom was filled with tension as they dove deeper into Oprah's role in the narrative surrounding Diddy. The prosecutor highlighted her connections to Diddy and her public statements, defending him, questioning her motives. Was she truly unaware of the severity of the situation, or had she simply chosen to ignore it because of their personal connection? As Oprah continued to defend Diddy, the prosecution brought forward another piece of evidence: text messages between Diddy and his security team. These messages, found on his phone, showed Diddy checking up on Cassie during the alleged abuse. The texts revealed a pattern of control, a man using his wealth and resources to keep his victims isolated to silence them. It wasn't just about the violence. It was about the manipulation, the mind games. Call me when she's awake. One message read, check if she's okay and make sure she doesn't speak to anyone about what happened. These texts provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who believed he could get away with anything. But Oprah's unwavering defense of Diddy now seemed less like loyalty and more like denial. It was clear to the prosecution that Oprah had chosen to look the other way to protect the man who had helped her build her empire, even at the expense of truth. As the courtroom sat in stunned silence, Briana Bangolan took the stand again. This time she would testify about the physical and emotional abuse she had witnessed and suffered at the hands of Diddy. Briana's earlier testimony had been chilling, but now she was back to share more details that had been buried for far too long. I saw it with my own eyes, Briana said, her voice trembling slightly. Diddy didn't just hurt Cassie, he hurt me too, and I'm not going to let him get away with it. Not anymore. Her words carried weight, and the jury could feel the intensity of the moment. Briana wasn't just a bystander. She had been a victim of Diddy's control, just like Cassie. The balcony incident, the threats, the constant fear, all of it was real. And now the world was finally starting to see it for what it was, a systematic pattern of abuse enabled by the people around him. As Briana recounted the night she had been dangled over the balcony by Diddy, the jury could see the fear in her eyes. She had been terrified for her life, and yet she had never fully spoken about it until now. The pieces were falling into place. Diddy was no longer just a powerful mogul. He was a man who had used his power to control and intimidate everyone around him. Briana described how she had tried to intervene when she saw Cassie being abused, how Diddy had warned her to stay out of it. "You don't know what you're messing with," he had said. "Stay away from her or I'll make you regret it." Yes, sir. The defense attempted to cast doubt on Briana's credibility, suggesting that her memory was clouded by her drug use. But the jury was no longer buying it. Briana had been a victim in this story, and her testimony was starting to hold the weight it deserved. As the trial continued, the prosecution's case became stronger with every new piece of evidence. Diddy's violent history was being laid bare, his control over those around him evident in every witness's testimony. And in the background, Oprah's defense of him began to unravel. The jury was no longer listening to her claims of innocence. They were listening to the survivors, the victims, the ones who had lived through the terror of Diddy's control. The question now was whether the jury would see through the layers of denial and manipulation, and whether they would hold Diddy accountable for the pain he had caused. The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear: the truth was finally coming to light. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The day's proceedings had already exposed chilling testimony, and now the final witnesses were set to take the stand. Briana Bangolan, the longtime friend of Cassie Ventura, had just laid bare the horror she endured at the hands of Diddy. Her voice quivered as she recounted the infamous balcony incident where Diddy had dangled her over the edge of the 17th floor ledge. The air in the room felt thick with emotion, and the defense was visibly scrambling. Oprah Winfrey, once an unwavering supporter of Diddy, was now in the hot seat. The prosecution had exposed the cracks in her defense of the mogul, citing her connections to Diddy and her attempts to dismiss the severity of the charges. Oprah's testimony had painted Diddy as a man misunderstood, but the flood of evidence that was being presented against him was undeniable. The defense couldn't escape the reality any longer. As Briana's testimony continued, she revealed even more devastating details about the night Diddy had locked her in a room at his house, refusing to let her leave. She had arrived looking for Cassie, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The moment she entered Diddy's private residence, the door slammed shut behind her. He refused to let her leave until she promised to stay silent. This incident had directly aligned with the timeline of Cassie's disappearance, something the media had reported but had never fully explained. "I was just looking for my friend Briana," said her voice breaking. "But he wouldn't let me go. He locked me in. I couldn't get out. I was afraid he'd do worse." It was a terrifying revelation. Diddy had a history of controlling and intimidating those around him, but this was something different. It wasn't just violence, it was manipulation on a grand scale. Briana had witnessed firsthand the toll Diddy's power had on the women in his life, especially Cassie. Briana's claims were backed by photos of her injuries, and the emotional scars she carried were evident to anyone who saw her. Her courage to speak out, despite the fear she'd carried for so long, resonated with the jury. They could see the truth in her eyes, the rawness of her experience. As the day drew to a close, the prosecution had placed a powerful case on the table. The defense was running out of room to dispute the mounting evidence, and with each passing witness, the walls were closing in on Diddy. The jury was being given the picture of a man who had used his power to not just control his victims, but to tear them apart physically and emotionally. And as Briana left the stand, the question remained, would the truth be enough to bring justice to those who had suffered in silence for so long? As the courtroom entered its fifth day, the atmosphere had shifted. What was once a legal battle over accusations and evidence was rapidly turning into a full-blown reckoning. Briana Bangolan's testimony had left an indelible mark exposing the dark truths about Diddy's actions and the toxic world he had created around him. Yet this was only the beginning. The most crucial moment was still to come, the testimony of Cassie Ventura herself. Cassie had kept her silence for years, but now she was ready to face the world. Her voice had been taken away from her for far too long, but here in this courtroom she was finally in control. She had been through hell and back, and now the world would know the extent of Diddy's cruelty. She took the stand with a poise that spoke volumes, her face a mixture of determination and sorrow. Her testimony was stark. Cassie described years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of the man she once loved. The twisted power dynamic had slowly unraveled her, forcing her into submission, using his wealth status and control as weapons. But perhaps the most chilling part of her testimony was when she recounted the times she had begged for help only to be met with cold indifference. I was trapped in a world of my own making. Cassie began, her voice trembling at the beginning, but growing stronger with each word. He promised me everything, but it was all a lie. I couldn't see it at the time. He had me in his grip, and I couldn't get out. Her words were sharp, cutting through the courtroom as she detailed how Diddy had isolated her from her friends, especially Briana. The abuse had been methodical. He would control her every move, every word, every action. He would manipulate her into believing that no one else cared about her, that only he could provide the love and security she so desperately needed. But in reality, he was just breaking her down, piece by piece. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her testimony sinking in. Cassie described how, on multiple occasions, Diddy had physically harmed her. She recalled the time he slapped her in front of friends, humiliated her, and made her feel small. The trauma was overwhelming, and yet she continued to stay. It wasn't just fear. It was a mixture of love, confusion, and manipulation. The most haunting part of Cassie's testimony, however, was when she talked about the time she had disappeared from the public eye. For days she was missing. The media had been in a frenzy speculating about her whereabouts, but in reality she had been held captive in Diddy's mansion, isolated from the world, unable to leave. The very thought of not being able to escape had haunted her. She felt like a prisoner in her own life. I couldn't leave, she said softly, but her words echoed across the room. He locked me in, told me no one could see me, told me no one could help me. It was at this point that the full scale of Diddy's cruelty became undeniable. Cassie's description matched the patterns of behavior Briana had earlier outlined. It wasn't just a toxic relationship. It was a cycle of violence and control, perpetuated by a man who believed he was untouchable. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, using his power and influence to silence anyone who dared to speak up against him. But what struck the jury the hardest wasn't just the abuse. It was Cassie's realization, her transformation from a woman in a toxic relationship to a survivor who had finally found her voice. She wasn't just testifying for herself. She was testifying for every woman who had ever been manipulated, controlled, or silenced by someone in power. "This is for every woman who feels like they have no way out," Cassie said, her voice strong now. "I stayed silent for too long, but today I'm not afraid anymore." The courtroom, which had been tense and silent, erupted into an unexpected wave of support. For the first time in the trial, the victims' voices had been heard loud and clear. Cassie had broken the silence, and in doing so, she had exposed the darkness at the heart of Diddy's empire. Meanwhile, the defense team was on the back foot. They had tried to discredit Briana and Cassie, poking holes in their stories, questioning their memories and motives. But with Cassie's powerful testimony, they were quickly running out of arguments. The evidence was stacking up against Diddy, and no matter how much the defense tried to obfuscate the facts, it was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom this wasn't just a case of personal drama. This was a systemic abuse of power. As the day ended, Cassie's words lingered in the air. The jury, visibly moved, was left to process the gravity of what they had just heard. For the first time, they saw Diddy for what he truly was, not the charming mogul the world had idolized, but a man capable of monstrous acts. And as the trial continued, it became evident that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, for the truth, and for the lives of those who had been silenced for too long. The trial had reached its pivotal moment. As the testimony of Cassie Ventura concluded, the courtroom sat in stunned silence, weighed down by the brutal truths that had just been revealed. What had begun as an investigation into a possible case of domestic violence had now become something far greater, an exposure of a pattern of control, manipulation, and exploitation by one of the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry. Diddy the mogul, who had once been untouchable, was now facing the consequences of his actions. With Cassie's testimony in the rear view, the prosecution brought in another key witness, Jane Doe, the second alleged victim in this case. Though her identity had been protected for obvious reasons, her story was just as harrowing. She was the embodiment of the crimes the prosecution had been laying out over the course of the trial. Her testimony was raw, powerful, and difficult to ignore. Jane had been another of Diddy's victims, but unlike Cassie, she had been brought into the web much earlier. She described how Diddy had initially seduced her with promises of fame and wealth, how he had manipulated her into believing that she was the key to his empire, and how once he had her under his control, he used her as little more than an object for his own desires. The same tactics, the same strategies he had used to control Cassie had been employed on Jane. Her testimony mirrored the stories of countless women trapped in abusive relationships, the gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, and eventually the physical violence. Jane described how Diddy would become enraged without warning, how he would fly into rages that left her terrified and paralyzed. She recounted instances of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and coercion, details that were so similar to Cassie's experiences that the jury could no longer deny the pattern. But it wasn't just the abuse Jane endured at the hands of Diddy that was unsettling. It was the way he used his power and influence to shield himself from the law, to manipulate people into silence, and to create an environment where women felt they had no other option but to comply. She explained how over the years she had been drawn into the world of sex trafficking, not because she wanted to be, but because she had been systematically groomed and coerced into it. At one point during her testimony, Jane described a specific incident that sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the courtroom. She had been at one of Diddy's lavish parties, surrounded by celebrities, high-profile figures, and powerful business people. It was there that she realized the full extent of Diddy's control. He didn't just use his bodyguards and assistants to keep tabs on her. He used his entire empire to trap her, keeping her in a gilded cage where the lines between love, money, and power blurred. "I didn't know who I was anymore," Jane confessed, her voice trembling. "I didn't know if I was a person or just an object someone he could dispose of at any time. That's the thing about people like him. They don't just hurt you, they make you feel like you deserve it." As Jane's testimony concluded, the room was heavy with emotion. The jury had heard from two survivors now, both of whom had given heartbreaking accounts of how Diddy had used his wealth and power to exploit them. There was no denying the evidence any longer. Diddy's empire wasn't just built on music and fashion, it was built on a system of control, abuse, and exploitation. The defense, however, wasn't about to give up without a fight. They tried to discredit Jane, questioning her motives and casting doubt on the authenticity of her story. They suggested that her memories were clouded by time, by drugs, and by the passage of years. But the prosecution was ready. They had the evidence to back up every word she had said, and they had no intention of letting the defense get away with undermining her testimony. It wasn't just about the individual stories of abuse anymore. It was about the broader implications of what had happened. The prosecution was not just trying to convict Diddy of personal violence against these women. They were trying to shine a light on the systemic abuse that was allowed to fester in the entertainment industry unchecked and ignored for years. But as the trial pressed on, Diddy's legal team had a card left to play. They brought in a character witness, a woman who had worked closely with Diddy for years, and who was prepared to testify about his generosity, his philanthropy, and his supposedly good nature. The defense attempted to create a portrait of Diddy as a misunderstood man, a businessman who had been caught up in a messy situation. They argued that the accusations against him were exaggerated, that he was a victim of opportunistic women trying to profit off his success. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, but the damage was done. The prosecution had already laid the foundation, and the defense's character witness only served to highlight the vast chasm between the public persona Diddy had carefully curated and the man who had allegedly perpetrated these heinous acts. In the final moments of the trial, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution, having presented a compelling case, reminded the jury of the women who had bravely stepped forward to share their stories. They urged the jury to remember the pattern of abuse, the manipulation and the coercion that had been laid bare during the trial. The defense, on the other hand, doubled down on their claims that the allegations were fabricated, that Diddy was the victim of a conspiracy, and that the case against him was built on shaky foundations. When the jury finally began their deliberations, it was clear that the stakes had never been higher. The fate of a man who had been one of the most influential figures in the entertainment industry rested in their hands. But it wasn't just about Diddy anymore. The trial had become about the women who had been silenced for years, about the justice they deserved, and about the need for systemic change in an industry that had long turned a blind eye to abuse. In the end, it wasn't just about a conviction. It was about the message that would be sent. It was about showing the world that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law. The jury had heard the stories. They had seen the evidence. Now all they had to do was decide what kind of world they wanted to live in, one where the voices of the voiceless could finally be heard, or one where power and money silenced those who dared to speak the truth.